Today we're going to go over shape keys. And shape keys are not super complicated, but you can use them to do very nuanced things. So just a review to sort of put it in the context of what we learned so far. So far we've learned how to add a keyframe to say this cube moves from here. You add a keyframe. Move this object. Move this whole mesh that is considered an object from here to here over time. And we can scale that object from here to here over time. And even when we scale that object and we move that object is still, in terms of its mesh, its actual shape, not changing. It's still a cube. It's still like those points are still the same distance from each other. It's still an equal quadrilateral cube. We are just sort of scaling it or rotating it or moving it, but we're not deforming it. Yeah? So what we're doing with shape keys is we're instead of adding a keyframe for the overall object, what we're doing is we're adding a keyframe to say this vertice right here is going to go from that position to this position over time. So we're going to morph our object. And so let me delete those stupid keyframes I just added. So in order to add a shape key, we're going to go into our context object data tab, which is where we have our vertex groups. The last time we visited this is when we added our pinning groups for our flag, which we did in vertex groups. We said, oh, I'm going to choose these vertices over here. I'm going to assign them to this group. So later I can use that group to change or say this group has different functions later on. Beneath vertex groups, there is shape keys. And this is where we add the different versions, the different morphs, or versions of our object's shape. So the first thing we want to do to start working with shape keys is we want to set our basis. So if I click on this plus sign here to add a shape key, the first thing that shows up is a shape key with the name basis. And this is important to do because this is the assumed natural state, natural shape of your object. The basis, we just established that this shape with these vertices and these positions is the core original shape. This is the thing we're transforming on top of, but we're working from this original shape. If I hit the plus key again, now we have our first key. And so this is the change we're now making on the assumption that we have this pure original shape, this basis, the basis of our shape. So next to our shape key, we have a value, which is now set to 0. And you can slide that up and down. Right now, while selecting our first shape key, key 1, and with our cube selected, I'm going to go into edit mode. Now, any changes I make to this object in terms of vertices or faces, etc., to the shape of that object are now going to be stored in our key 1. And I'm just going to make like a rough, weird distortion here. So this is now the shape for key 1. If I go back into object mode, those changes disappear. And we go back to our basis shape, our original shape, which we first established. And if I click between these two, nothing changes. And that's because for key 1, we have the value next to it. We need to change that value to be something larger than 0 to see that change expressed. And if that value was 1, that means it is completely making that change, completely that new shape. And if it's like 0.5, then it's halfway there. So it's a way to sort of it's slowly morphing from the original shape into key 1. which is this weird pinch at the top shape. And so I can now add a keyframe. If I right click on key 1 here, I can insert a keyframe. I can also do the same thing by, so we have, if I click on key 1, we don't add keyframes to basis, our original shape, because that is just understood. We're not like morphing that. That is our basis. We're not making changes to that. We're having changes layered on top of our original shape. So if I click on key 1, either to the right of it, I can right click, insert keyframe, or beneath it, there is a value there as well, and there is a dot next to that, which tells me I can add a keyframe. I can move forward in time, 60 frames, make a change to that value, and add another keyframe. And if we play, we can see it morph over time. And it looks kind of cool. If I wanted to add another keyframe, maybe we'll have this morph out. So let's morph out at 120, change that value to 0, add a keyframe. So we have it shrinking, holding that, and then releasing. Let's add another keyframe, or shape key. And maybe I want to give this a name. I could double click on that text and say rotate. Rotates top. And now I could go into edit mode with that shape key selected. And I could select those top keys or vertices and maybe just rotate on the Z axis a little bit. And I could add a keyframe for that. Turn the value up. Go down. Add another keyframe. And if I'm in edit mode at any point, and I change my shape keys, if I select different shape keys, it's going to show me what that shape is in edit mode. I'm switching between these different states of this object. It's always good to remember that if you're trying to make any tweaks to know which shape key you're selecting, you have selected when you're making changes in edit mode. So let's see what we have so far. We have it doing that weird shrink thing, that it twists. Let's see what happens if I add both of these shape keys at the same time. Let's add a keyframe for key 1, and we already have one for rotate top. Let's turn them both on.
Oh, check. Click this. You see, you have it as a complex whole. Make it a match.
We see it shrink. Twist, and then shrink and twist.
Try this.
And when you have two different keyframes on at the same time, they're sort of working not exactly in tandem with each other. They're sort of both vying for manipulating the basis at the same time. And sometimes that can have weird distorted effects. With this, it's fine, because I did just rotation for this, and this other key, shape, there was no rotation. But if I were to like rotate it in the opposite direction, and say that was what's going on, having those both on at the same time makes it sort of invert on itself. So it can get weird when you have multiple keyframes on at the same time, as long as they're not working against each other, because they're both essentially trying to do the same. They're both trying to transform a vertice at the same time. So it's it might push in weird ways. But generally what you can do is you can fade between shape keys. Yeah? So let's make something a little more fun and less boring. Let's try to make a sort of like a slimy, sort of bouncing ball kind of thing, or something that can sort of like try to use this for what it is good at, which is like trying to deform an object in ways that are helpful. Like when I did an example of the UFO looping GIF where it was sort of going back and forth, I had that UFO like stretch out and then it like shrink whenever it hit an object to show it kind of like compressing, to give it some sort of like a jello-like quality to make it seem like alive and to exaggerate the motion going on. If we have like a ball bouncing, in real life, when you see a ball bounce, you don't really notice it because it happens very quickly, but any ball that bounces deforms and like compresses, and that's part of why it bounces back up. If it does not compress, it will not bounce. Like a bowling ball will not bounce really. The floor might compress. So let's try to do something like that. Let's add, and let's see. Let's add a UV sphere. And I'm going to go with a less complicated one. By default, when you add a sphere, there's a little option that comes up on the bottom left, and that happens when you add any object into a scene. It gives you some options before you finalize and introduce this object. And I'm going to change the amount of segments to half that, and rings to half that as well. And I'm doing that just to give myself less vertices to have to worry about when I'm making these shape keys. And I can always make it smooth by adding a subdivision modifier to it. So let's see here. Let's have this ball sort of like jump. Let's see if we can make this ball like jump. I'm going to add a little plane just so we have a reference point. So I'm going to add a basis to this ball, which means the original shape of this ball is a perfect sphere. And I did so by hitting the plus in the shape keys window. And again, that's in the object data tab, third from the bottom. It looks like vertices, essentially. And now, after adding a basis, the true form of this object, I'm going to hit plus again, and I'm going to add my first shape key. And I'm going to call this compress down. And with that shape key selected, if I go into edit mode, I'm going to maybe go into wireframe so I can select through my object, and I just have select box activated. And I could try to move this down, maybe slowly, try to compress it. And that looks okay, but it's kind of like, it's going to take a lot of fine tuning to get that to sort of like curve down and look more natural. So I'm going to do something else. I'm going to just delete that shape key, make a new one. And I delete it just by selecting it and hitting the minus key. I'm going to do another compress. And I'm going to turn on a different tool here, one that we haven't done yet. And this is called proportional editing. You can do this in object mode as well, but it's mostly used in edit mode. It's at the top of your screen in your 3D viewport. There is, towards the right of your options up here, and the shortcut is O. Turns on proportional editing. Shortcut is O, and it is this dot with a ring around it at the top. And so what proportional editing does is it allows you to select one point, and then you can manipulate that point, and it sort of will manipulate all the points around it to a certain degree, to a certain fall off, and sort of pull them with it, like as though that point has gravity and can pull all the other points with it. So if I turn on proportional editing, and then choose the top point on my sphere here, and then grab, you see that other points are moving with it, but the further they are around it, away from it, the less effect that sort of pull has on it. And you can see that sort of area of influence is displayed by this ring that we have, this like wire ring that we have right here. And if I want to change the area of influence for this, I can use my scroll wheel on my mouse to affect that. So we can shrink it, and at any point we can make that larger to affect more things around it. I had a pretty good shape just a second ago. So I'm going to go like, we'll do some like, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to just do this. And then maybe I'll loop select a whole bunch. And expand it a little bit. And again, I'm just adjusting the area of influence for our proportional editing until it feels like I'm grabbing and having the influence I want to make on my shape. So now we can change the value for the shape key. And what I'm trying to do is have this ball kind of squished and then try to jump. It's like I'm trying to animate the ball itself jumping. So it's sort of like rearing back and sort of compressing itself in order to like shoot itself up into the sky. So we can have, maybe it starts at 20 frames. Let's make compress at 0. We'll insert a keyframe. We'll go forward 10 frames. Turn on that shape key. And then the next step might be what? Like, just sort of guessing. If we have, just thinking as an animator, we have our basis shape, then it's sort of like compressing as though it's sort of pulling back down. And then maybe the next step would be sort of like a teardrop, like this. So this section is like pushing forward. And the bottom is sort of left behind, sort of like sort of elastic, sort of being the last part that's pulled up by its energy. Maybe the final point of the sky will be this going whoosh and sort of like flattening out. Something like that. Those might be our shape keys we need here. So we have the sort of jelly bean first one. Now we're going to have it launch. We're going to make a new shape key. And when I make this next shape key, let's give it a name. We'll call this launch. Oh, I'm going to save my file. Important step. And I created this new shape key. When I go into edit mode, even though I have keyframes on for compress, when I go into edit mode with that selected, we're back to a fresh palette based on our basis, our initial state. So let's see what we could do here. Maybe I'll start at the top, grow my selection by holding Control and pressing the plus sign, sorry. Again, I want to have proportional editing on, which is at the top of your screen here, far right, the dot. Shortcut is 0. I'll write that down in the class notes real quick. Proportional editing. Shortcut. Oh. So to make this next shape, I would need to maybe pull this up. Maybe I'd make the area influence larger. And then maybe, I don't want to like pull the whole shape up. When I animate this, I want to add manually the keyframes for moving the object through space. I just want to make the shape I want. So I'm gonna move it back down a little bit so it's kind of still in the same relative position where like it's sort of touching the ground. And maybe I'll pinch in the bottom. So again, I want to select this whole ring here. So I could go, look at it from the front, go into wireframe, select it all, or I can loop select by holding Alt or Option and clicking. Then I could scale down, whoops, move down my area of influence. Maybe it's the next ring I want. Something like that. Almost. Let's do them both at the same time. sort of. Oops. I'm just sort of maybe spending too much time on this, but it's fun. So we have compression, and then at this point maybe we wanted to start morphing into the launch. I could add a keyframe. Selecting launch in my shape keys window, I could add a keyframe for the value. Move forward in time, maybe about another 10 frames. Turn that on, add a keyframe. But right now, if I look at my shape key window, compress and launch are both at 1. So they're both sort of fighting each other to change the shape of this object. So as we turn on launch, and I'm going to get my dope sheet here, so it's going to give us a better look here. Where's my dang objects? Show me in the dope sheet our stuff. Anyways. We're going to want to turn off our compress. So we already have a keyframe for it at 1, and as launch turns from 0 to 1, we want our previous keyframe to morph out to 0. I don't know why it's not letting me see my objects here in the dope sheet here. I want to see my layers here, dude. No, give me a second. It'll pop up. So we have, boom, like that. And then our final up in the air position will be a third shape key, air. When we edit that, let's just make it sort of squished. And maybe have like an inverted compress from the ground. And then we can have that animates in, maybe a little bit shorter, maybe 5 frames. Animate in, and as that animates in, we need to animate out our launch. So as one comes in, the other one goes out. So now we could just add some location keyframes to our object. We have it compressing. At this point, it might start moving up, so we could add keyframe for location. Have it launch up, maybe pretty high. Let's see how that looks. And then eventually fall, which would go back down to whatever our initial state was. Why isn't it showing me? That's not what I want, man. There, I don't know why. Anyways, now we can see each of these options. I looked at it in the graph editor just so I can see my keyframes. And we have our shape keys here. We can see them turn on and off, and sort of wave in between each other to form that shape. And now we want, I know that I want this to fall to the same position as it was when it started the animation, so I could take that first keyframe for Z location. I could duplicate that. And maybe we'll have it hang in the air a little bit. So if I grab the second keyframe for where it's up in the air and scale that out, we can see that there's more time where it'll be like resting up there. And it looks like this is actually where we want it to be in the air. So we can move over our keyframes a little bit. Boom. We'd maybe want it to fall out of that shape around here, back into its initial ball. And then as it makes contact, maybe it would compress again. Now I'm going to slope to that so it slowly morphs back. How many keyframes we're at? We're at 80. So now I have this cute jumping ball. And it's morphing, you know? We have the basic motion of it going up and down, but by adding these subtle tweaks to its shape, we are exaggerating that sort of jumping motion. And what was before just like a ball bouncing is now a character, is now a thing that has like inertia and is like purposefully doing this. We now gave this ball a character. We characterized it. So let's try this same effect, and this is just fun to play around with. I'm going to save this, and maybe I'll post this if that's helpful on the class notes if you want to look at that blend file. On the class notes, though, I have at the very bottom an example of a head to experiment with. And I'm going to click on that, and you can download this as well if you haven't already. And this is a head of my friend Dustin, who I did a music video for a while ago. And this is just a base head. It's not the most, like, I don't know, it's just a head I'd share with everyone. It looks kind of weird. Right now, the default for this file, if we notice, if we go into render mode, it looks different. Why do you think?
It's the deviates with the.
Yeah, it's a different render engine. So this is in cycles by default. When I was working on this, I was rendering in cycles. If we want to look at it in EB, you could switch over, see how that looks. Maybe. A little bit different. But that's not super necessary. I'm going to go back into cycles because why not? So, we want to make this head smile. How might we go about doing that using shape keys? I'd start here. I'd start in my object data and go to my shape keys. I'd add a basis to say the basis for this head, the default shape is just a head like this. I'd add a new shape key, call that smile, and then I could go into edit mode and I could make him smile by changing the vertices on that face. But it's not really moving the way I want it to. What would I want to do to more gracefully edit this mesh? We just learned it. I want to move a lot of vertices, but only select one. What would I do? Proportional editing. Thank you. And I made this file in an earlier version of Blender. We use Blender 2.81. This was made in 2.79, and a lot of changes happened. So some of the things we're used to seeing at the top have moved. That's because it's importing like an older version. If you encounter something like this is why. If you download something off the internet and it was made in 2.79, your interface might look a little bit different when you open it up. So I don't see my shortcut. Oh, there it is. It's at the bottom. That's why. There it is. All right, so proportional editing. And one thing you might notice is that and it kind of looks cheesy, but hey, we're just having fun here. When I edit one side of this, the other side is moving as well. And that's because when you're doing some editing, you want to have, especially if you're working on a human head, there is symmetry going on, always in a human head, unless that head is deformed. When a lot of people build human heads or model them, they will really just model half the head and duplicate the other side because there's always going to be a bilateral symmetry going on. And so when you're editing a head, generally, unless like there's like a twitching going on one side of the head, you know, something like that, you're making the same changes to both sides of the face. So to make things easier on you and to have like a nice symmetry going on, you can turn on symmetry when you're editing. And to do that, you go to this tab at the very top, which has like a screwdriver, and like a wrench. And you go into options, and there's an option for X mirror. If I turn that off and then try to make a change, it's only happening to one side of the face. If I turn that on, it mirrors that change. And maybe I could just close his eyes a little bit, because people smile with their eyes as well. It's kind of hard. And then if I turn on smile, he's smiling. A very subtle change. I could add another one. What's the next expression we should have? Anybody? Throw something out. Anger. So maybe we would furrow the eyebrows, pull them in. Because when you get angry, your muscles just sort of contract right here, and that's how you make that. It sort of pulls the flesh in together. Maybe squint a little bit more. And I'm just adjusting the area of influence to try to get more fine-tuned. Question?
Yeah. Can we use these heads in our midterm?
Don't use this head.
No.
No. But there's lots of heads on the internet to find.
So we could.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. For the midterm or for the final, I encourage you to use pre-made models. If you find one that you like, use it.
Cool.
You're going to have to model some things yourself, but that's just going to naturally have to happen. But, yeah. Yeah, so, and like, what else do we have here? We have, maybe closes his mouth a little bit more. It's helpful to go into orthographic view sometimes. One thing that I'm noticing is that when I make a change here, right now I want to edit just the top lip or the bottom lip. And I turn on proportional editing, but there's a way to make changes here where it's just to the vertices that are connected to your reference point. So right now we have proportional editing turned on. If I hold Alt and hit O, we can turn on connected only. We can do that also in the drop-down menu next to it. If you click connected only, our icon is still highlighted, but there's like a gap in the center. And so now when I edit, only the vertices that are close is sort of drawing a line of influence through connection to that point, which makes it easier for me to edit a mouth. And now I can make an exaggerated, like, pouty, angry face. Smile and anger. It's fun, right? Anyways, that's one of the ways in which you use shape keys with human heads. Anyways, that's the demo. I'm going to stop and upload this, and let's do lab time.